Lara Marlowe, and I am really thrilled to be chatting to her this evening. I first met Lara over 20 years ago when we were colleagues in the Irish Times. And then not long after that, I took a year out and went to study in Paris, and was not being a good saver now or then, was quite impoverished during that time, which was a marvellous almost a year. And I remember Lara bringing me for a really nice lunch in a posh restaurant, and also thinking that I would possibly be able to cover matters in Paris when she herself wasn't there. And I remember being actually mortified, because from a reporting point of view, it would have been no bother, but my French was, and still is, despite having gone to the south of France for 2 weeks at the start to do an intensive language course, pathetic. So I think I may have done, one article the entire time.
You're welcome, Alison, anytime.
So look, Lara is, I'm sure her journalism is well known to many of you. Her career began in her first byline, to those of you who read the book, and by the way, the book is, Lara will be signing the book afterwards, was in 1981 in the International Herald Tribune, and that was when she was based in Paris. Her, I can say, even though I'm not, don't have either a good ear or a voice for it, that her French is impeccable. She's worked for the Financial Times, Time magazine, as I said, for the Irish Times for the last couple of decades, and I think is such an important part of their coverage, and particularly in this day and age when print journalism is in such straitened circumstances, that the Irish Times maintains their foreign correspondence, and particularly somebody with Lara's experience. And I suppose I've always admired Lara as a journalist for her fearlessness, for all of the places that she's gone to and covered war and conflict: Beirut, Afghanistan, Iraq, I should say Washington, which I suppose which would be relevant. If she were still in the US, I'd be okay with that. But not just that. It's not just Lara's ability to go to those places and to seek out the stories, but that she has such a beautiful writing style, because there's little point in doing that unless you're able to write and communicate and do it in such a way that people read it and it has an impact on them. So Lara is going to start with reading from her book, The Things I've Seen. She's going to do a reading from it. Then we're going to have a chat, and afterwards there will be an opportunity for questions, and I'm sure there will be a number of those. And just one thing, if you wouldn't mind putting your mobile phones on silent, and Lara's going to start now and give us a reading from The Things I've Seen.
Thank you, Alison. I see a couple of my students here. That's great. And forgive me if there's any repetition with what you heard this morning. I actually wrote this preface to this book a number of years ago, and I reread it this afternoon and found a couple of things had dated. But basically, when I wrote it, it was sort of my testament. It was everything I had learned from journalism, what I felt about what I had seen, and my worldview, if you like. So I think it's pretty much still valid. On a spring morning in 1981, as Alison said, I handed over a coin at the kiosk on the Avenue Hoche, picked up a copy of the International Herald Tribune, and turned to the back page. There was a photograph of Alain Robbe-Grillet, the father of the Nouveau Roman, whom I had just interviewed. I didn't know then that sub-editors, not reporters, write headlines. The title on the article was different from the one I had thought up before I posted my copy to Neuilly. The bastards, I thought. They ran an article by somebody else. And then my eyes fell to the byline, where I read, for the first time ever in a daily newspaper, by Lara Marlowe. I yelped for joy, I leapt into the air, and I ran around in circles. My life as a journalist had started. I wrote another article, another and another. Some were rejected, there were setbacks. Nearly 3 decades, actually it's nearly 4 decades now, several thousand articles later, I think the last time I looked it was about 4,500, believe it or not. I'm still pleased to see my byline. I turned 30, then 40, then 50, and actually then 60. Middle age didn't creep up on me, it jumped out and said, boo. But 2 filing cabinet drawers, actually 2.5 now, full of articles were proof of the passage of time. They confirmed the breadth of my French experience, chronicled 8 years in Beirut, recounted nearly a decade of bloodletting in Algeria. From the siege of Sarajevo to NATO's punishing bombardment of Serbia, I had seen the breakup of Yugoslavia. And I should add now, I also lived through the first term of Barack Obama, which is missed very much, or he is missed very much. Without my realizing it, my life fell into neat historic segments. France and Ireland were my home base and refuge, and I often found their footprints in the regions where I traveled. But Lebanon, Algeria, and Yugoslavia dominated the 1990s, Afghanistan, Iraq, and the US, the first decade of the new century. I watched the Americans bomb Kabul, then Baghdad. Vietrakistan, as my friend the American journalist Mort Rosenblum calls it, was the recurring theme of the 2000s. Much of my work was done from the safety of Paris, but without ever intending to be a war correspondent, I reported from front lines in Central America, the Horn of Africa, the Caucasus, and especially the Middle East and Iraq. The wars I covered, big and small, short and long, added up to some 15 conflicts, depending how you counted. Among the images that swarm through my mind is a narrow monastic room in a retirement home in Burj Hamoud, the Armenian quarter of Beirut. An icon of the Virgin hangs between 2 beds in which lie a husband and wife, aged 105 and 97, respectively. Both are blind. They listen to Radio Yerevan in their waking hours. The old man bears a scar on one cheek, etched by a saber at the Battle of Tannenberg, where he fought on the side of the Tsar's army in 1914. The following year, when the Turks began the first genocide of the 20th century, he made the long march to what was then Mesopotamia and across the desert to Lebanon, where he met his wife. Had his life been happy, I asked him. I hate my circumstances now, he said, but the things I have seen, no one has seen. I once asked my dear friend, the French academician Michel Déon, who passed away last December, whether I should write fiction or non-fiction. Anyone can write a novel, Michel replied. You have seen things no one else has. Writing novels remains the mirage that tantalizes one through the slog of daily journalism. Yet I have loved this profession as one loves a place or a person. No adventure matches that paring down of belongings to a single suitcase and heading for the airport. Journalism, I realize now, has given me a far more pungent taste of life than any ivory tower. Indeed, journalism has given me many lives. Each time I have moved on to a different country or conflict, the world has seemed new. And every time I have escaped a close call, I've wondered whether, like the cats who've been my companions, I'm exhausting my 9 lives. In my reporting, I strive for authenticity, to freeze the fleetingness of time, to preserve people and situations in all their intensity. It is a paradox, for ours is a transient medium. As a French colleague liked to remind me, newspapers are meant to wrap fish the next day. Like the proverbial fisherman, some of my best stories got away. I searched fruitlessly through archives and old diskettes for 3 articles that fell victim to last-minute confusion, rivalry among editors, and the dictates of political correctness at Time magazine, which employed me for 8 years. I loved the story of the Kuwaiti newspaper editor, Faisal al-Marzouk, because it had a happy ending, and there aren't many that do. On the day the Iraqi forces fled Kuwait City in February 1991, a wealthy woman pleaded with me to find her brother, who had been taken to Basra by the Iraqis, along with hundreds of Kuwaiti civilians. Eventually, in the middle of a cold night on the Iraq-Kuwait frontier, I stuck my head into a dozen coaches filled with newly released prisoners. In each one, I shouted, "Is Faisal al-Marzouk here?" From the photographs I had seen, I would not have recognized the grimy, disheveled man who fell into my arms weeping when I told him, "Faisal, I'm a friend of Salwa, Jassim, and Siham. They asked me to look for you. They're waiting for you." In 1994, I worked for weeks on a story slugged Tale of Two Cities about Beirut recovering from civil war, just as Algiers plunged into darkness. I wrote thousands of words on the Arab capitals, but a dream recounted by Alia Said, an upper-middle-class Beirut matron, taught me that wars never end for those who lose loved ones. Alia's late husband, Rafiq, had come to her in her sleep a few nights before and said, "Hurry up, Alia, get ready, we're going to see Fuad." The Said's son had been killed years earlier in crossfire between Kurdish factions near Beirut's Green Line. Rafiq died of grief. Alia lived like a zombie, playing bridge and holding dinner parties, trying to fill the void where her family had been. Eventually, her liver gave out, destroyed by the amphetamines and tranquilizers she took to get up in the morning and sleep at night. Now, another story which I thought I had lost and refound again in a filing cabinet this last year has just been published for the first time in the current issue of Irish Pages, which is published in Belfast, I believe, so you can read it if you want to. But it was titled Family Saga. And again, I did this story for Time magazine, and again, like the other two I've mentioned, it never ran. This story recounted but this one was really for political reasons. It recounted the history of a Palestinian family who had been scattered by the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. Some of these Palestinians clung to their native Galilee. Others fled, so they were Israeli Palestinians, in other words. Others fled to Lebanon and Jordan. My editors at Time magazine thought the problems of this Palestinian family ought to have been solved by the 1993 Oslo Accords. When that turned out not to be the case, they lost interest. But I shall never forget Abu Ahmad, the patriarch of the Amman branch of the family, sitting at a table in his prosperous restaurant, burying his head in his hands when he spoke of his childhood, saying, "Mirun, Mirun, I cannot forget you." Mirun, of course, was his village in Galilee. I visited Mirun with Abu Ahmad's Arab-Israeli cousins. Their family's graceful stone houses had been transformed into a yeshiva for the study of Jewish sacred text. I spoke in French with one of the inhabitants, a Talmudic scholar who had emigrated from Morocco. As the Palestinians hung back, fearing confrontation, I asked the Jewish man from Morocco what had happened to Mirun's Arab inhabitants. "There were never any Arabs here," he said curtly, ending our conversation. Suffering is the lot of mankind. If my reporting sometimes strikes a chord in readers, I believe it is because I feel tied to the people whose pain I describe. As T.S. Eliot wrote, I am moved by the notion of some infinitely gentle, infinitely suffering thing. Some, like the parents of children who died violently in Ireland and in France, became friends. Most have been swallowed up by distance and time. I do not forget them. There is Leila Behbahani, the 3-year-old Iranian girl whose body I saw in a cold storage warehouse in Bandar Abbas, one of 290 civilians killed when the USS Vincennes guided missile cruiser shot down an Iranian airliner in 1988. Leila was on her way to a wedding, and she was wearing a turquoise party dress. She died with the contorted face of a child who was crying. Captain Will Rogers III, the commander of the Vincennes, was given a medal. There is the woman in the smoldering, blood-spattered ruins of UNIFIL's Fijian Battalion headquarters in Qana, southern Lebanon, on the 18th of April, 1996, less than an hour after Israel had bombarded the post, killing 106 Lebanese civilians. She squats on the ground, her arms laced around her father's torso, rocking on her ankles and sobbing, "Abi, Abi, my father, my father." He cannot hear her, for his body has been cleaved diagonally by a proximity shell. Nothing happens in isolation. Sometimes the link is obvious. The cancellation of elections won by Islamists in Algeria precipitated years of bloodshed. I still believe that the Lockerbie bombing was retaliation for the downing of the Iran air flight 6 months earlier. And although it is heresy to say so, when Al-Qaeda murdered close to 3,000 people in the atrocities of 9/11, I sensed immediately that it was connected to the slaughter of Muslims in Lebanon and Bosnia, to the festering wound of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. When I covered the Haitian earthquake in January 2010, I was surprised at the worry expressed by friends and colleagues. They seemed to think I would be traumatized by so much death and devastation. It was far easier than a war, I told them. No one was trying to kidnap me or kill me. But most of all, I didn't feel that rage that comes from seeing innocents die under bombardment. In all the wars I covered, the Geneva Conventions were regarded as a quaint museum piece at best. In 1999, the US and NATO blurred the line between civilian and military targets by bombing a passenger train, power plants, telephone exchanges, the Serb radio television building, even the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. Time and again, the US military has killed civilians when they shot down the Iranian Airbus, bombed Albanian refugees in Kosovo, shelled journalists in the Palestine Hotel in Baghdad, carried out drone attacks in Afghanistan and Pakistan. As long as it's an accident, the Americans seem to think it's okay. The Israelis learned the lesson well, testing the Dahiya doctrine, which is named after the Shia Muslim southern suburbs of Beirut in Lebanon, where they killed 1,287 people in the summer of 2006. Under this doctrine, no distinction is made between civilian and military targets, as demonstrated horrifically in Israel's January 2009 assault on Gaza, which killed 1,434 Palestinians. And since I published this, the July-August 2014 war, in which about 2,220 Palestinians were killed. And that's compared to 71 Israelis, of whom 67 were in the Israeli Defense Forces. The words international community make me nauseous, for they've come to embody inaction, indifference, and hypocrisy. It was the international community that allowed the siege of Sarajevo to continue for almost 4 years, during which Serb gunners picked off 10,000 people like ducks. The same international community made empty promises about lifting the siege of Gaza, about rebuilding Gaza and Haiti. And I had said that if Barack Obama had any idealism left in him, he would forge an international community that was worthy of the name. But I think that with Donald Trump, we can forget about it. Sorry. I've learned simple things. that governments lie, that as Benjamin Franklin wrote, there was never a good war or a bad peace. I've learned to appreciate my own good fortune, having seen how little stability, security, or well-being exist outside the fortress of our developed countries. At the Fèile an Phobal in West Belfast in the summer of 2010, I was asked if I despaired of what the American poet E. Cummings called mankind in one word. I didn't want to sound negative, and I strained to find examples of heroism. On occasion, I have encountered humor, generosity, altruism, even beauty. But for the most part, I have found the world to be, as Matthew Arnold described it, without joy, love, light, certitude, peace, or help for pain. The instruments of suffering are usually remote, fighter bombers at altitudes of tens of thousands of feet, the secret minutes of politicians' meetings. Only occasionally does one glimpse the face of cruelty in a Serb prison camp commander, or more recently, in an Arizona sheriff who glories in chain gangs of hungry prisoners and the deportation of Mexican migrants. Despite the sadness and anger, I remain endlessly fascinated by the human condition. I still want to know what will happen. Looking back at this juncture, I said this mezzo camino, but actually it's more than halfway now, I'm afraid. I have found something approaching a meaning and a purpose, to be there, to see, and to record.
Thank you for that, Lara. I'm curious to start more with we'll begin with the personal. How somebody born in California, who I think either your first or one of your first jobs was with CBS News 60 Minutes, ended up based in Paris with a house in Ireland, covering conflict, French politics, American politics, and basically global events for the Irish Times.
How much time do you have? You could say, if I was going to be flippant, I would say it was globalization. No, the truth is that I was married to a British journalist called Robert Fisk, who took me to Beirut very romantically when the war was still on. And he taught me a lot about journalism. He's a great journalist. He's a really, really fine journalist. And I suppose I probably wouldn't have bought a house in Ireland myself. I wouldn't have had the contact with the Irish Times and with the Middle East had it not been for him. So I owe him a lot, despite everything.
But we may get back to that. Roll back a little bit as to how, sort of born in California to even, clearly you studied in the Sorbonne, you know, the fascination with France.
The original passion for me was France. And actually remains, because it's been 3 years since I covered a war, and I'm not sure if I'm going to be running off to any wars very soon, because for one thing, in Syria you get beheaded now, which is very pleasant, obviously. No, my original passion was France, and that started when I was 5 years old. And I've told this story so many times, I'm afraid of boring you, but my mother was a widow, and she had 4 children, actually, and she went off to the Middle East and Europe with her church group. And when she came back, she had this big plastic Air France bag full of souvenirs. And there was all kinds of stuff in there. I can't remember all the other stuff, you know, from London, and she'd been to the New York World's Fair. And the only 2 things that I just fixated on totally was the little bronze Eiffel Tower and a cheap souvenir scarf from Paris with the monuments of Paris, the Eiffel Tower and the Arc de Triomphe and so on the scarf. And it's possible, I suspect that she said to me, "Oh, Lara, you'd really like Paris." There was probably a power of suggestion or something. But from the time I was 5 years old, I wanted to go to Paris. And when I was 7 years old, I had a chance to take some French lessons. And then I came down with chicken pox and cried a lot and wanted to go to French lessons even with chicken pox, and they wouldn't let me. And then when I got to secondary school in California, there was a proper French class, and I started learning French. And the rest is history. When I actually emerged, I took a charter to Paris when I was 19. And then I took the metro. I took a coach from Le Bourget and then the metro to the Place de la Concorde, because I knew it was in the center of Paris. I didn't really know what it was doing. I had a rucksack. And I came out of the metro in the Place de la Concorde, and I was gobsmacked. I was just stunned. And I still have that thrill when I ride a bus across a bridge over the Seine. I still love Paris. I really do. I love Dublin too. And I love Cork and Bantry too. But Paris is very special to me.
Can I ask you then? I suppose it seems to be when your love for Paris so shines through, to bring it to more contemporary and living in Paris today. to many of us on the outside, that would seem like kind of a scary experience now, and for fear of terrorist attacks. And has life changed a lot there?
My life hasn't changed, although I must admit that after the Charlie Hebdo attack in January of 2015, that was bad. And then it was almost as if every time one thought one was getting over it, it was wham, another big blow. And there was that horrible Germanwings crash. You remember where the German pilot deliberately crashed his plane and killed 150 people. And then the Irish Times sent me to cover 2 attacks in Tunisia. There was the one at the Bardo Museum in Tunis, and then the beach attack in Sousse. And then that autumn there was it just all kept piling up. There was this bus that burned with old age pensioners near Bordeaux, and another 42 people burned alive in that. And then the climate conference happened, which was actually a good thing. But by the end of 2015, I was pretty wrecked, actually, all that. And I even, told my editors, I feel like I'm the massacre correspondent. Oh, and then, sorry, how did I forget? Of course, the Bataclan, November 13th, 2015, that was the worst of all, in a way. And it was just awful. And then 2016, of course, the Bastille Day was again horrific, absolutely horrific. And then the priest, Father Jacques Hamel, who had his throat slashed near Rouen, that was grim too. And every time these things happened, Muggins here would trot off with her computer and pen and tape recorder and so on. And it really wore me down. I realized, I wasn't suicidal or anything, but your morale is really hard. But at the same time, I sort of felt like, well, the rest of the world lives with this kind of violence and mass murder. And so we're just catching up with the rest of the world, or it seemed like the Middle East had caught up with me in France in a way. And I must say that when Emmanuel Macron was elected, it was pretty obvious he was going to win, but one felt a bit insecure after Brexit and Donald Trump. And I wasn't particularly a partisan of Emmanuel Macron, and there are some things about him I'm not that keen on, but I actually found myself getting choked up and tears running down my face. I was so happy, I was so relieved that finally something had gone right, something good had happened for France. And that feeling, that new feeling of positive outlook and hope, and something good is happening, that is still there, and it's been a couple of months now. And so, we're just hoping, and I fear there probably will be more attacks. I hope there'll be nothing on the scale of
And
of
has
the
it
Bataclan
changed your sort of daily life in Paris? Has your attitude
Not mine.
changed, or your...
No, there once or twice I was in the metro. I mean, there are, and I almost hate to say these things, you feel like you're tempting fate, but there haven't been suicide bombers in the metro as there were in London, or in, say, a Paris bus, as there also was in London. So you're always thinking of where could it happen where it hasn't happened yet. A few times I'll see big crowds of people, like along the Seine on the weekend nights, or on the Esplanade des Invalides. Young people go out and picnic en masse. Or you just see a cafe terrace with a lot of people laughing and drinking and having fun. And very often it sort of gives me a shiver, and I think, wow, they're tempting fate, but they're right, you have to go on living, and you have to enjoy life, so that's as it should be. But it's still there in the back of your mind, absolutely. But I haven't changed it. I would never, actually, after one of the attacks, I can't remember which one, I asked a friend if she wanted to go to a theater performance, and she said, no, I just don't feel comfortable going out. And a lot of people said that sort of thing to me, or people wouldn't go to the big department stores out of fear. But that's ended now. The department stores are full, there are more tourists than there have been in 10 years, and people seem to have forgotten. So I hope they're right.
Sticking with France for a moment, and I was going to say on a lighter note, but I don't think that's quite the word I'm searching for. I'm thinking, you mentioned Macron, I'm thinking of Trump's visit last week, and most specifically what he said to Brigitte Macron, telling her what good shape she was in. I'm wondering how that went down, and did the French pay too much attention to that, or what was there?
Well, Macron was still in the honeymoon period, sort of grace period, There was a little bit of criticism, but not that much. I think people are so pleased to see France being taken seriously again, to see France back on the world scene. And it was interpreted as Macron wanting to do just that. And Macron always stresses we have to talk to everybody. With Trump, he kept saying, our friendship with America goes back to the revolution. Our friendship with America is more than 200 years old. I am friends with Donald Trump because the French people are friends with the American people. So he kept justifying it that way. And so it was almost like saying, well, it's in my genes, or...
And Trump's remark on his wife, I mean, was there much attention paid to that?
Yeah, well, there was a lot on social media. I mean, it was pretty crude, She's only 7 years younger than Trump. She's 64 years old. Trump is 71. And he looks at her and says, wow, you're in great shape. And the words for a 64-year-old woman were understood, it was like the cartoon blurb.
Well, I think it was an Australian minister who said indeed that she was in considerably better shape than he is. So I mean, it's as I'm listening to you talking there about the attacks in Paris and the atmosphere, it's ironic, I suppose, for somebody like you who would have gone to cover wars and then going back home to Paris or maybe to your house in Dublin, that was the refuge. Mm-hmm. But also that one would imagine that maybe did all the conflict that you covered, has it prepared you better for that sort of a scenario?
Maybe in the sense that you just get on with it and you don't allow yourself to get emotional about it. Having seen real massacres, like, for example, the Bataclan, by the time I got there, it happened late at night, and the first priority was to get to my computer and start filing to the newspaper, and I knew it would be cordoned off by police, and I got there the next morning fairly early, but you didn't see anything. You didn't see any bodies or pieces of bodies, and you could imagine, I could imagine it very well, because I had seen that sort of thing at Cana, for example. So it has, in a way, you're not in shock. I mean, you do get a bit hardened, too, by all of this.
Yeah, you mentioned Cana there, which is, I suppose, a really stark part of the book, and what's of particular interest, maybe even for the audience here, you were with the Irish battalion of UNIFIL at the time, travelling with them, and the Fijian battalion was under attack. So you might just explain, take it up from there, what happened.
I'm sure all of you remember because the Irish were in southern Lebanon for so many years. Actually, I think they're back now in Nakura, but every 2, 3, 4 years, it happens in southern Lebanon, it happens in Gaza as well. Something really angers the Israelis, either a soldier is captured or somebody fires a rocket, or there's some incident that sparks off a major Israeli assault on southern Lebanon or the Gaza Strip. And they, I've seen it described as a hammer against a gnat, or it's totally out of proportion, and they bomb and shell more or less nonstop for 2-3 weeks usually, and they kill 1,000 or 2,000 people every time. And that was what was going on in 1994, yes, April 1994. And I had gone down to Tibneen to see Irish Bat, and I was in a UNIFIL vehicle on my way back. And the Israelis justified it because Hezbollah fired 3 mortars, and any of you who've been in the military know that a mortar is not actually a major weapon. They're about half the size of my arm, and it could kill you if it hit you on the head, but it's not a big weapon. And Hezbollah had fired 3 mortars from a field several hundred meters away from the UNIFIL battalion headquarters. And the Israelis knew very well that there were about 800 Lebanese civilians sheltering in this battalion headquarters. And they just let loose with this horrific bombardment of proximity shells, which are anti-personnel weapons, which are designed to cut you into pieces. And that's exactly, they explode above the ground. They don't, an ordinary artillery shell goes into the ground and destroys a building or something, but it doesn't explode above the ground to kill people. And the bombardment lasted for 17 minutes. It later transpired, we learned that there was an Israeli drone overhead, and the drone operator could watch in live time, in real time, what they were doing, which sends shivers down my back still, actually, that they knew what they were doing. And what happened, because I was in the UNIFIL vehicle, I could hear the radio traffic. And the radio, there was a Lebanese army position across the street from the UNIFIL position, and they were saying, stop, stop, make them stop. And they were radioing our vehicle because we were the closest UNIFIL thing. I said, tell them to stop, they're killing civilians, there are men and women and children here, tell them to stop. And so our radio, it was an Irish officer, I think he was from Cork actually, Eamon, he'll come to me anyway, was saying to Nakura, get them to stop, tell the Israelis, because the UNIFIL acts as a sort of intermediary. And I'll never forget the quote, the Lebanese army guy came on, he said, people are dying, he said, we hear the voice of death. And when we got to within minutes of the bombardment stopping, we got to the gates of this compound. It was on a hill, and there was literally blood flowing down the hill. And it was I could go on, but it's pretty grim. It was the absolute worst thing I've seen ever anywhere. And for weeks, if not months, it was as if there were a screen up here just above my forehead, and I would see the images over and over and over, just going. Apparently that's what post-traumatic stress syndrome, that's what happens to you. So I guess I had it and I got over it.
You point out in the book that we wouldn't have learned in school of Cana, the wedding feast of Cana. This is the site of where we were told that Jesus turned water into wine.
10 years later, I covered another massacre there. It was, instead of 106 people, the second time it was about, I think it was in the upper 20s, 27 or 28. I can't remember how many people died the second time. But it was, the Israelis were doing a big assault on southern Lebanon, and they bombed a building, and there were a lot of women and children in the basement. And I was there, again, totally by chance. I was living in Paris by then, but I was covering it for the offensive for the Irish Times. And I saw the women and children's bodies being dug out of this basement. The same village, little southern Lebanese village.
So, Lara, you describe that in the book, sort of being in the midst of that, be it there in Cana, in Iraq. There's a description of you talking when you're in Baghdad during the US invasion and trying on this mask that you were told would protect you from chemical warfare, which sounded about, as my recently departed father-in-law would have said, as useful as an ashtray on a motorbike. And in Beirut, that you were this close to death, this close to the sound of the bombs going off, and I thought to myself, I wouldn't survive 24 hours there.
You would. You'd be fine, Alison. You'd be fine.
No, Lara, I wouldn't. Actually, I can tell you that now.
I don't know. I always told myself when I was going to these wars that there are always a lot more people who survive than who die. There were a few things that scared me. I think the invasion of Iraq was very frightening because there was so much talk about chemical weapons, and even the Americans they had all these wonder weapons that could destroy whole city blocks and football fields and this kind of thing. So there's a lot of hyping beforehand that does make you a little bit nervous. Actually, I remember on my way to Baghdad, I took the last flight into Baghdad before the war started. And the airport security in Amman, I had one of those little tiny nail clippers, for your fingernails. I mean, about this big. And they confiscated my nail clippers. And the absurdity of the world we live in. And the other time I found really, really frightening, funnily enough, being bombed isn't that scary, because you sort of figure, well, if your building takes a direct hit, it's over before you know it, or if you're in basement shelters, you sort of tell yourself you're safe, they won't hit me, or that sort of thing. But snipers are really, really frightening. Sarajevo made me very, very nervous. And the other thing that was possibly the scariest thing of all was Algeria in the 1990s. they used to go and slash the throats of foreigners in their beds at night. It happened to an Italian ship in the port in Gigel, and they would also go up to cars in traffic, and there are traffic jams in Algiers like there are in every city in the world, and just a gunman would just hold a pistol up to the head of the person in the taxi cab or the car and just shoot them in the head in traffic. And that happened several times. And I actually, fortunately, I'm what the French call passe-partout. I just kind of blend in, and I've been taken for French, Algerian, Syrian, Lebanese, and almost everywhere I've been, they just take me for a native. So I didn't worry that much about myself, but my ex-husband looks like a Brit.
He does.
And he really does, And so he used to read Al-Mujahid in the back seat, up like this.
So when you would go to a conflict zone, what would you or do you see as your job?
To be there to see and to record, as I said in my preface. I like writing.
I suppose I asked I should have added the question now in terms of reporters now, even more common that are embedded, and that you're seeing life from one side, and you're obviously then have an obligation to the side that's transporting you and protecting you, and where that sits in your view of war reporting.
Well, I've done very little embedded reporting.
But you've read embedded reporting, and how that compares to what you would do.
Well, even on the rare occasions when I have been embedded, for example, in the 91 war, I was in Saudi Arabia for Time magazine, and they had a pool slot reserved for Time magazine, and my colleagues, those big, brave men who were based in Cairo, were a bit worried, but they wanted to see how it started and whether or not they were going to come or not. And so I had to reserve the Time magazine pool slot. And even then, I was very subversive. I was on an airbase in Bahrain, and I remember interviewing a pilot who'd been on a bombing raid over Baghdad, and just sort of asking him, there's women and children under them. So you can still ask the big questions even if you're embedded. Just because you're embedded doesn't mean you can't ask them. And then in Iraq in the mid-2000s, when everything was going wrong as we knew it would, after George W. Bush invaded the country, I wanted to do a story on the attempts they were trying to keep the Sunnis and the Shias from massacring each other, and the American army was going into Sunni neighborhoods, and they were helping them protect themselves because the Shia were killing them, and so on and so forth. And the only way you could actually even get into, they had become walled communities. Baghdad became this sort of little series of city-states. The only way you could get into it was to be embedded in the U.S. military. And that was a fascinating story. And I went in and I could talk to the Americans and I could talk to the Iraqis, and I could see that they absolutely did not understand each other and were not at all on the same wavelength, and how it was all going to fall apart and so on. So you can work even in that way. When you're on your own, it's better. I don't know if it's safer with the military, because whenever I was with, say, U.S. military, I would feel like a target because I was with them, because people would attack their vehicles and their tanks and so on.
And what about covering conflict now in an era of social media?
I'm not very big on social media, which probably makes me an old fogey. I learned to tweet 3 or 4 years ago, and I thought for 2 or 3 days, I thought, well, this is really fun, and I was just tweeting constantly, and then I realized I hadn't written any stories for the Irish Times, and that wasn't really my job. And I've noticed there is a sort of backlash now against Twitter. I think Donald Trump is giving Twitter a very bad name.
But how has social media maybe affected the fact that so many other people are on social media, even the people in war-torn areas now are on social media?
That's true. Actually,
or that you're covering something somewhere that is being beamed out live just by citizens.
In the Syrian war, you're absolutely right, Alison. There's a lot of citizens journalism, and a lot of what was known about what was happening in Aleppo was coming out. There was that 8-year-old girl whose name I've forgotten, whose mother, who was an English teacher, was helping her do a blog. And so that's really valuable. The question it always raises, of course, is how do you verify it? How do we know this is real? And of course, the Assad regime was claiming that all of this was false and fabricated, and that these people weren't really Syrian, that the opposition was doing propaganda. And there's always that risk of propaganda with social media. But I would go by my gut feeling to judge whether or not. I think you can tell. And then that 8-year-old girl was real. We saw photographs of her.
Yeah.
And
so you mentioned earlier that you didn't think you'd like to go to Syria. I mean, do you think if
no, I would.
You would. Oh, you would. Oh, sorry, I got the impression. So that if your news desk or if the foreign desk in the newspaper rang you and said, Lara, we want you to go next week.
Well, there are two questions. Do you go to Damascus, where you're under the thumb of the regime, which is, it's basically the equivalent of being embedded with the Americans, only probably worse, because you have a government minder. And I have worked that way. I've worked under Milosevic in Belgrade, where we had minders, and I worked under Saddam in Baghdad with minders, and under Assad, I've been to Syria many times. But I think the benefits of that are fairly limited, because you do see and hear what they want you to know, and it's useful, it's worth doing, but it has its limits. Going into rebel-held areas now, I mean, I knew Marie Colvin, who died in
Sunday Times.
Yeah, that would have been around 2012. She was killed in an government artillery bombardment. And I had a very close French friend who's still alive, thank goodness, Nicolas Hénin, who was a hostage in Iraq. He was a hostage of Islamic State for 10 months, and the French government bought him out with 2 other journalists who were being held. He was very lucky he was French, because I am an American citizen, and the US government will not lift a finger to help a journalist who gets kidnapped. And James Foley, who was beheaded, was a very good friend of my friend Nicolas Hénin, and Nicolas was obviously very, very upset. So I think covering Islamic State, it's not like covering Hezbollah in Lebanon was. You could go and I could talk to Hezbollah, I could interview their Secretary General, I would put on a headscarf, which some people might criticize me for, but I didn't have a problem with that. I would go to the southern suburbs, and even during bombardments in southern Lebanon in 2006, I would go and talk to Hezbollah. You don't go and talk to Islamic State if you're a Westerner. They'll kill you. And so the nature of the conflict in the Middle East, I would never have dreamed it could get as bad as it is. I would never have dreamed, and I really, really am very angry with George W. Bush and Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, because they created this mess. They destroyed Iraq. They absolutely destroyed it. Saddam Hussein was bad. He was a nasty dictator, but to go in and overthrow him without a clue what they were going to do, when the results were so predictable, or actually the results are much worse than I could have predicted. I couldn't have imagined an Islamic State. So.
What about when you come back, Lara, and you see the things that you've seen and the passion that you speak about there, about the state that Iraq has been left in, having been there for the war, having covered the war is what I mean, and to realise that you go back to real life, and that people often aren't really registering what's going on, or the horror of it, or that something that happens much closer to home with a tragedy, but with far fewer people dead, registers, 1 million times more.
I'd sort of forgotten the anger and frustration of that. You're right, Alison. Fortunately, Ireland, people are interested. Yeah. Invariably, I found that when I come to Ireland after covering a war, people want me to come and talk to their university or their school, or if a taxi driver finds out I've been in Baghdad, he wants to know all about it. My neighbors in Howth, where I have a house, want to know about it, which is great, because you do want to talk about it. In Paris as well, that people by and large are curious. The worst place I found was California, where what is left of my family lives, where nobody ever asked me a single question. It's as if, you've been around to the corner shop and oh, hi, yeah, I just come from Baghdad. Oh, great.
You covered that it's interesting reading the sections of the book on the US and your time there. And I read a whole page where I thought you could actually take out the name Bush and put in Trump, and you could
Trump is worse.
No, I know, but in terms of, I completely agree with you. I mean,
Trump,
he
hasn't started any wars yet.
No, that's true. But in many ways, he makes Bush look like a, kind of a
genius.
Yeah, exactly. But there's quotes you're talking about Iraq, the lies that have been told about Saddam. I think this is a quote you're saying: "There's none so blind as he who will not see." Truly, America's irrational streak runs deep. I mean, you sounded quite, a lot of it, and even what you said tonight, quite despairing of your countrymen. And I saw something in the last couple of days where it said, I think, that only a quarter of Americans have passports. I mean, it's an extraordinary level of...
I thought it was 8%, actually.
Is it? So it's even less. So it's quite an extraordinary level of insularity, isn't it?
Well, America is a continent. I mean, with Mexico and Canada, and it's very far away. And these jihadist attacks have struck the United States. You might remember the one in San Bernardino. That's next door to where I grew up. And I was stunned, and I was sort of thinking, wow, I've probably driven past that school and so on. That's why 9/11 was such a shock to America. They hadn't been hit in America since Pearl Harbor, and that was Hawaii, which isn't really America, but to have Manhattan, the Pentagon, to be struck in the heartland like that, was just, people couldn't believe it. I think, yes, there's a lot of ignorance about the rest of the world. One of my students in my workshop said this morning that she found it very hard to take ignorance about current affairs and about the world. And yes, I find it hard to take. But I find that there are really two Americas. And I saw it very much in the 2012 campaign, which I covered. I was following Mitt Romney around and Barack Obama around and, going on camping buses and this sort of thing. And the Obama voters were normal people. And not all Republicans, because I actually have friends in California who vote Republican. I don't know if they voted for Romney. I think they probably didn't. But, you had the sort of mainstream establishment Republicans who, whatever you thought of them, they were a legitimate party. I mean, people like John McCain, I wouldn't have voted for him, but he's a politician. Some might say a statesman. He'd been a prisoner in the Vietnam War and so on. And then you had what we called wingnuts, and this is the term the American press uses, who were people like Michelle Bachmann and Herman Cain. Remember the pizza delivering guy, Herman Cain, and then Rick Perry, who's now Secretary of Energy, and Sarah Palin, for heaven's sake. and you're sort of thinking, what planet have these people come from? And these were people who believed. I remember on the campaign trail with Mitt Romney, I was talking to a guy at a rally, and he said, well, Barack Obama is a Marxist Muslim. And I said, wait a minute. I said, is he a Marxist or is he a Muslim? He said, he's a Marxist Muslim. I said, no, he can't be a Marxist Muslim. Because Muslims believe in Allah, and Marxists are atheists, and there's a contradiction there. And he says, no, his middle name is Hussein, so he's a Muslim, and his parents were both communists. And so what do you do? How do you reason with these people?
But yet America elected Barack Obama.
They did.
So how then did the same country elect Donald Trump?
It wasn't the same country. It's two. There's two Americas in one, and there's one America which is mostly on the West Coast and the East Coast, which is educated, which has some kind of sense of what goes on in the rest of the world, which cares about the rest of the world. And there's another America that is mostly inland, which is ignorant. I hate to say this, and it's not pleasurable for me to criticize my own country. But I can tell you on the morning of November 9th, about 5 in the morning in Paris, when I realized that my country had elected Donald Trump, I was wailing like a wounded animal. I was walking around the apartment just pacing. I hadn't been that upset since 9/11. Actually, in a way, it was worse than 9/11 because I was just total incredulity. Mm-hmm. And the only way I kept my sanity that day was by sitting down and writing a cri de coeur, an opinion piece for the Irish Times. And so sometimes journalism can be good medicine. And I still have it, when Trump was in Paris and I covered his press conference with Macron, and he opens his mouth and I just, just looking at the guy. I'm sorry, he'll probably watch this video and have me, have my citizenship lifted or something. So you can give me a sign.
You'll be glad of that house in Hoth yet. Now I'm going to open it up to questions now, but I have one last question for Lara, which I know might seem quite trite, but I'm curious about, so indulge me. If you were to be sent to Syria next week, for instance, and actually personally I hope you don't go. It's too risky, even though I'm sure your journalism would be.
I'm on my summer holiday.
Would be amazing.
No.
What would you pack?
I don't think I even have a flak jacket anymore.
So that'd be the first. If you did, a flak jacket would be the first.
Well, if I was going to northern Syria, say I had Trocaire or Concern or an Irish Aid group who's in there, who's working in there, who was willing to take me in, at equal risk with their people. Yeah, I would try to get a flak jacket, and I still have I think I have my helmet in the cellar. Helmet is actually more important than a flak jacket, although a lot of journalists just wear the flak jacket, which is kind of silly.
Why? Why is it more important?
Because your brains, if you get a head wound.
Fair enough.
If you get a head wound, you're incapacitated for the rest of your life, a bad head wound. Your heart and lungs are pretty important too, obviously. But okay, flak jacket, helmet. I take silly things like I always take an electric kettle, because a plastic one that doesn't weigh very much. Because you can't imagine when you're in a hotel room in a horrible place, if there's electricity, what a comfort it is to be able to make yourself a cup of tea. And I take things like they have those face wipes, to take off your makeup, where you don't need water or anything. You can just clean your face, and I would take all that sort of standard stuff. I would also take good earplugs for bombardments. The French make these silicone ones that are really kind of soft. They used to have really hard wax ones, which were awful and hurt your ears. And the good soft silicone earplugs I would take. I always stock up on biscuits. I like biscuits. I lived in Afghanistan for 3 weeks on nothing but sugary biscuits. I was perfectly happy. I'm lucky that way.
And in terms of doing the actual tools of the job then, being able to send the copy back?
Portable Toshiba, tape recorder, the iPhone. I used to travel around with the sat phone, which was always a nightmare. I still to this day have nightmares that I'm trying to set up the sat phone and I can't get the connection, or I'm trying to send my story and it won't go. And I had actually one of my most desperate moments as a journalist was in Mogadishu in 1993. I was there for Time magazine, and I had a sat phone and I couldn't make it work. I think they've improved a lot since, but the sat phone wouldn't work.
It sounds a bit like the Leaving Cert dream, doesn't it?
Oh, but you haven't heard it all. So I was up on the roof of the Sahafi Hotel. Sahafi means journalist hotel in downtown Mogadishu, and one of the your colleagues will always save you. So they used to anyway. But one of my colleagues let me use his sat phone, and as a result, I was on the roof of this hotel in Mogadishu in the hot sun, and I didn't think for a moment about it. I went back down to my room, which was shared with about 6 journalists, and there was nothing on the screen of my Toshiba. And the sun had burnt the liquid crystal display of my Toshiba. And I had a 2,000-word cover story to write for Time magazine, and I could probably see about 10 or 20% of each letter, just, straining really hard. And I had to write this whole long story without being able to proofread it or see what I'd written. It was like you were blind, And that was one of the hardest things I ever did. I was pretty proud of myself. I got it done.
God, you were entitled. Now, I'm sure there are questions for Lara. So if you wanted to put up your hand, there are microphones. If you want to say who you are, feel free. If you don't want to, that's fine too. There's somebody just over there. Yep. Just wait 1 sec for the mic so everyone will hear you.
I admired Lara and met her in Paris a number of years ago. I'd like to ask her, would she feel happy to be awarded an honorary Irish citizenship?
Yes, please.
What a really great suggestion. I should have said that Lara has been awarded the Chevalier de la Légion d'honneur, which is the highest honour that the French government can award to a non-citizen.
Just finally say she's a marvellous woman and a really wonderful journalist.
You're very kind. Thank you.
Here, here. Well, that sets a high bar now for the next questioner, who's just down there. Yeah.
Thank you. So I have a question for you with your experience in the Middle East and North Africa. What do you see for the next waves of refugees coming to Europe? Who is going to be their advocate or advocates? What do you see in the future?
It's very grim for the refugees. I mean, it's very clear to me that the Europeans don't want these people. The Italians and the Greeks are already saturated with them. They can't handle them. They're not getting enough help from the other EU countries. Angela Merkel was criticized very heavily in Germany for her openness and generosity. And although she hasn't backed down on that, Germany is taking a lot fewer people. Macron says that he wants to be humane and he wants to show solidarity with genuine refugees, because they always make this distinction, in many cases false distinction, between economic refugees and political asylum seekers. I know, for example, I have my fixer interpreter in the Gaza Strip. He was a terrific young man who would be a credit to any country that he lived in. Who is in absolute misery, and he sends me, they're almost like suicide notes over and over, and it's terrible, and there's nothing I can do to help the guy. And he knows, he told me he had at least 10 friends who'd managed to get out to Egypt and get on these leaky boats across the Mediterranean. And I don't really see now, Macron and Trump a few days ago said they're going to solve Syria. Well, good luck. I would like to see that. I really, really hope they will. But, and you know, you've already got something like, I think it's 13 million Syrians displaced internally or refugees outside Syria. You know, at some point, will there still be more refugees leaving? At some point, will it stabilize? Will it stop? And then look at Africa, the demographic bomb in Africa, just millions and millions of people with global warming, with climate change. Even if the wars and the dictators don't drive them out, the heat will. So I don't really see this flood of migrants or refugees, whatever you want to call them. I don't see it stopping, and nor do I see any solution to it. I don't see how they can be accepted, welcomed with open arms, and integrated into Europe. And it's going to be one of the big issues for decades to come.
Okay. Yeah, just here? Yeah, just 1 second, we get the microphone up to you.
Hi, Lara. It's great to see you in person after seeing your little picture in the paper all those years. I wonder, can you comment, the recent, after President Trump's visit to Saudi Arabia, there's been some activity, I suppose, down there. And one of the things is this threat to close down Al Jazeera.
Qatar.
In Qatar. I'm wondering, could you comment on that? They have presented it as being an attempt to, because Al Jazeera is promoting false
Islamism,
etc. Do you think this is likely to happen? And if it does, could you speculate on what the effect might be on people who rely on it for information?
I used to watch Al Jazeera English. It's been a while now since I've been watching it, but I thought it was pretty good. And I think it would be a shame if it was shut down. But Qatar is a strange animal, you know, Sunni Muslim leaders who are very, very friendly with Iran, which is why the Saudis are boycotting them. I think that Trump's realignment of U.S. policy to be totally great friends with the Saudis, who are at the origin of radical Sunni Islam, is very dangerous. And also he's made Iran again, you know, public enemy number one. I don't really understand it. This is based on what? You know, because Iran, and it's far from being a perfect, you know, it's not a Western democracy, okay, but I actually like Iran a lot. I've worked there a lot, and I would infinitely prefer living in Iran to Saudi Arabia or even Qatar for that matter. I mean, Iran is a really vibrant, interesting, creative place, and it does have a few crazy mullahs, and you know, there are human rights abuses, don't get me wrong. But to say Saudi Arabia is our friend and Iran is our enemy, and they're the axis of evil, or the whatever they're calling them now, is very dangerous and absurd in my opinion. And that's what's behind all this anti-Qatari movement and the movement against Al Jazeera. And Al Jazeera was the best television network in the Arab world. And if that's shut down, it augurs ill for freedom of expression in the Arab world as well.
I hope somebody's keeping a country count, because Lara is racing through them, showing her incredible knowledge. Just down there at the back, about 3 rows up from the back, and I saw there was somebody there in the middle. We can come next to, yeah. If you stand up, maybe actually, so that they can see. Yeah. Oh, you've got the mic.
Yeah,
Great.
thank you. I noticed that when you related to the recent conflict in Gaza and to the casualties in that conflict, you specified the number of casualties on the Israeli side that were in the Israel Defense Forces, and you didn't mention what's been well documented, that over 40% of the casualties on the Palestinian side were Hamas fighters, which suggests to me an abandonment of even the pretense of objectivity. And I'd like to ask you then what remedy you would propose for the Israelis who have rockets coming into their cities from civilian populations, regardless of how many people those rockets might hit, or more pertinently, what you would suggest that France might do if its cities were shelled with rockets from a neighbouring territory sanctioned by the sovereign power in that territory from civilian populations.
No, actually, the casualties in the UN estimate is that 2/3 of the approximately 2,220 Palestinians killed in Gaza, 2/3 of them were civilians. Okay, perhaps I should have said that it is estimated that 1/3 of them were Hamas fighters. It's still 2,220 human beings killed in that assault, compared to a total of 71 people killed in Israel. Okay, so as usual, the proportion is totally skewed. I once ran into a New York Times correspondent in Gaza when one of these assaults was going on, and he said the same thing you said, you know, Israeli cities under rocket fire and so on and so forth. You should go to Sderot. He said the Hamas is firing missiles the size of a car at Sderot. So I went to Sderot, and the Israelis have stacked up all the so-called missiles it's the courtyard of a sort of police station in Sderot. And the biggest one, it was a bit bigger than this. It was about 3 times that size. Okay. They've got them, all the casings on a rack. Yeah, look, I'm not excusing it, but I do think that if you were in the world's largest open-air prison, which is what the Gaza Strip is, where people are living in 40-degree heat with 2 or 3 hours a day of electricity, where there is virtually no hope for anyone there of having a normal life, of working, earning a living, raising a family. I think you'd probably fire rockets too. I'm not saying I excuse it. I wouldn't want to be an Israeli living in Sderot, but I think you have to give the Palestinians some alternative to becoming human bombs and firing rockets. Give them some hope, have a little bit of generosity of spirit.
I'm going to break in here. I've realised that I've really fallen down on my job, in that is when I mentioned all the countries that Lara has spoken so knowledgeably about, I realised that the story that's closest to home, that Lara has covered so extensively, I didn't. So if you'll indulge me for a minute, I'm going to do that. That is the story of the murder of Sophie Toscan de Plantier. And Lara has reported extensively from the French side of that, with her parents, her and her extended family. And I suppose, Lara, it's curious, I was in Bantry at that time and a journalist for the Irish Times. So I actually was one of the first reporters on the, apart from obvious exceptions, on the ground, and was down here for a couple of weeks afterwards. And I always remember, actually, it was spectacular weather for January. It was West Cork at its best. So you then had it on the other side, the French side, and maybe if you talk for a few minutes about that.
Appropriate, the
Yeah.
sirens going by. That weighs on my heart. I know it's crazy, and it's not up there in the league with Palestine and Iraq and so on, but to see an injustice done, to have known her parents for the last 20 years, and see the suffering that they've been through. It's just really, really tragic. And it's also, the great question in my mind is, how can it be that a French judge has charged someone, is sending him to trial by an assize court in France, believes that there is sufficient evidence for that, and the Irish justice system has obviously not come to the same conclusion. And is not moving in any way that I can see. And now there's question of an extradition, and it looks like it won't happen because it didn't happen the last time, and there's this legal technicality about reciprocity, and so on. I think justice delayed for 20 years is obviously justice denied, and I don't know what her parents say is there has only ever been one suspect. If he didn't do it, then please tell us who did. The evidence is circumstantial, but there's a lot of circumstantial evidence. Scratches on the hands and forearms, on the forehead, an absence of several hours at the time when the murder happened, burning clothing a few days later in a bonfire outside, not to mention at least 7 confessions to people. I mean, what he said to Malachy Reid, what he said to the gardener who was working with him about having seen her in the Spar, in the grocery shop, and having wanted her, and it was a very strange thing. All of this came out in the defamation trial. I'm sure you all remember it in December of 2003.
But Lara, what about a seriously flawed Garda investigation?
That's a problem. That's a problem, but look, I'm not a lawyer. The first serious flaw, and you know this, Alison, because you worked on the story, was that the state coroner a state pathologist, sorry, get my terms mixed up, a state pathologist didn't arrive for something like 36 hours, and the body was cold, and there should have been DNA samples and so on. So it's been a mess from the very beginning, but because the guards made some mistakes, and I believe that they were cleared, weren't they, in that trial? There was a lawsuit against the Garda Síochána and
But I think any objective analysis would also say that there were seriously wrong things that occurred during that investigation, and that I suppose that it's a question of
but does that mean
if somebody has not been found guilty by the Irish justice system, of that particular crime, is it right then to transfer the crime to the French system?
The legal systems are very, very different. In Anglo-Saxon law, which is basically what Ireland has, it's beyond a shadow of a doubt to convict someone. In French law, it's un faisceau de présomption, something like that, or un faisceau de preuves, which means a sort of a bundle of evidence. You know, so it's easier to convict someone in France than it is in Ireland. Okay, so you know how. I don't know really how you deal with that, but I do know that in this case, I would really like to see justice done. And I think probably everybody in this room would like to see justice done. And it's a failing somewhere of someone that it hasn't happened.
Yeah, I think everybody would agree with that. I think we have time maybe for maybe one last question. Yep, and actually that person had their, or did he? Yeah, just down there at the back. Thanks.
Just to say that I also, needless to say, admire you, and that you've been in horrific situations and reported the truth back to us. And I'm sometimes intrigued about people's personal lives. What do you do to unwind? And if you had a choice of places to go on holidays, where would you go?
That's a nice question for a last question.
If I could go anywhere on a reporting trip.
No, pleasure.
Oh, a leisure. I'd like to go to Howth, County Dublin, please.
Why? What? I mean, it goes back, there's a nice circularity to this, because I'm saying you were born in California, based in Paris. What gives you the graw, the love for Ireland?
Actually, Ireland and France have a lot in common. I think that the love of the language, the love of literature. One thing Ireland has which the French don't have is optimism and cheerfulness and sort of warm, fuzzy friendliness. The French aren't very good at that. And they have other qualities. What's that Yeats quote about the centuries of misery which survive, punctuated by brief periods of joy or something.
Yes, yes.
I love your sense of humor, and just the warmth of people here, and the beauty of the countryside too, especially when it stops raining.
Okay, I think we'll all take that, won't we? Listen, I would like to thank all of you for listening so intently. It sounded like I certainly enjoyed it. It sounded from the silence that all of you did. And I would really like to thank Lara for a fascinating last hour and a half or however long it's been, and wish her well for the rest of her holiday, which when she leaves here is going to take place in Howth. Okay. Well done. Well done.